Good evening and welcome. This is the 31st Forum in the Roundtable series. The topic as advertised is the selling out of Australia, and the panel of three speakers are James Cogan, John McCrae and Nick Fox, and they will speak in that order. Each speaker will address the topic as he chooses, and it's not a debate, it's a panel. And questions from the audience will be invited when all three speakers have concluded and not before. No questions or comments will be taken till then, and no interruptions will get any response whatsoever. At question time, raise your hand, and you need to come up to this microphone, and if you don't come up to the microphone, your question will not be recorded for posterity, and you would hate that. Also state which speaker you're addressing. That'll save time. The Roundtable Forums are sponsored by Western Heritage Australia. That's the name of the group which is sponsoring the meetings. It's a long-established study group which aims to raise consciousness on all issues of social and public concern and to network for creative social change. That includes almost everything. Am I speaking too close into the mic? What do you think? No, I'm not. We have no connection whatsoever to any political, religious, cultural or commercial group or organisation of any kind. We are totally autonomous. All monies received are spent on organising these forums and in running our website, and in doing this we don't make a profit, we actually run at a loss. All opinions expressed by our invited speakers are entirely their own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the policy or the philosophy of Western Heritage Australia. They're speaking entirely for themselves. Our next forum is number 32, and that'll be in 3 months. The destruction of democracy. Your forward flyers call it the death of democracy. That is the first mistake I'm going to tell you about. It's the destruction of democracy, but it makes very small difference. It will be held in the Jubilee Room at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, August the 11th. That's in 3 months. Please take an advance notice flyer. Now, there's a couple of small mistakes that have been made, which I have to draw your attention to on the flyer. The first is the spelling of Mr. John McCrae's name. It's not M-A-C-C-R-A-E, it's M-A-C-R-A-E, capital R-A-E. And the second mistake is that Nick Fox's organisation is not the Australian Protectionist Party, it's the Party for Freedom. That is the name of his party. Unfortunately, we got information from an old website which was inaccurate. The Party for Freedom. Okay. Now, the first speaker tonight is Mr. James Cogan, and he is National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party and a regular contributor to the World Socialist website, which is focused on the United States pivot to Asia and Australia's role in this. So I'd like to introduce Mr. James Cogan, please.
Well, good evening everybody, and thank you to the Forum for the invitation to speak this evening. The topic for tonight's discussion, the selling out of Australia, contains within it an assumption I consider to be false. It assumes that there is some homogeneous entity called Australia with a homogeneous population of Australians who have more or less identical interests and aspirations that can be sold out. The reality is that Australia, like every other country, is a bitterly divided country, riven above all by antagonistic socio-economic interests, that is, class interests. This reality finds a sharp expression in the development that in certain circles which I'll review is being presented as the selling out of Australia. And what I'm referring to is the unconditional support for US foreign policy and the US-Australia military alliance by the overwhelming majority of Australian-based financial and corporate elite, the establishment, political parties, the media and its commentators, in academia, in artistic and cultural circles and throughout the military, police and the ever-expanding intelligence apparatus. This support is being given not, as some people claim, because Australia's current crop of politicians are a bunch of lapdogs, or because they lack independence. It is because the material interests of the wealthiest sections of Australian society are directly bound up with the declining global economic, political and military dominance of the United States. The working class in Australia have very different interests, and I'll come back to and conclude on that point. But firstly, I want to just briefly review the sheer scope of Australia's collaboration with its US ally, which has given rise to the accusation that Australia is, quote, being sold out. Australia is on the front line of what is called the US pivot or rebalance to Asia. What US strategic think tanks openly discuss is an attempt to curb the growth of Chinese geopolitical influence, and which includes concrete preparations for military confrontation and war. The pivot was announced on the floor of the Australian Parliament on November the 17th, 2011 by President Barack Obama, the fraudulent candidate of hope and change. It was facilitated by the Greens-backed Labor Party minority government headed by Julia Gillard, who herself had been installed as Prime Minister in a factional coup to oust Kevin Rudd, in which one of the motivations was the opposition within the Labor Party and certainly in Washington to Rudd's suggestions that the United States make an accommodation with the rise of China. The refusal of the United States to entertain any accommodation to China's economic growth was bluntly spelled out in the March 2015 report for the US Council for Foreign Relations. The conclusion of the report states, "There is no real prospect of building fundamental trust, peaceful coexistence, mutual understanding, a strategic partnership, or a new type of major country relations between the United States and China." The unstated conclusion running through the report is that the only prospect is conflict. Earlier in the document, the authors declared, "Australia is the southern anchor of US relationships in the Pacific, and as a nation facing the Indian and Pacific Oceans, an essential link in US Indo-Pacific strategy. It sets out goals such as the United States using the Stirling Naval Base near Perth to support increased US naval force structure, operating surveillance aircraft and drones from the Australian-controlled Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean, and increasing the scope and frequency of Australia hosting of rotational deployments of US military personnel." Such recommendations were already made in the June 2012 report submitted to the US Defence Department by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, and again in the report released in November 2013 by the Centre for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Since Obama's election in 2009, the following has taken place in this country. The satellite targeting and spying base at Pine Gap has been dramatically expanded. Northwest Cape in Western Australia has been redeveloped from a communications base for US nuclear submarines to one of the most critical bases for US counter-space operations, with space spying technology due to be operational at that facility by 2016. In February, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral John Grennett boldly announced at a lecture at the Australian National University that the US and Australia are in discussions about permanently rotating an amphibious-ready battle group in Darwin for part of the year and rotating or even basing an entire aircraft carrier battle group at Stirling in Perth. Darwin, of course, courtesy of the Labor government, already hosts a marine rotation. On March 30, Grennett told the US Navy Times that in July the US will send to Darwin the still unformed America Amphibious Ready Group, which consists of the massive American Assault Group America and 3 other assault vessels. They will presumably be taking part in the Talisman Sabre exercise from July-August, which at the moment is already estimated to be involving over 30,000 US and Australian personnel in what is dress rehearsals essentially for war in the Asia Pacific. Now, my organisation, the Socialist Equality Party, and our international publication, the World Socialist website, has thoroughly documented these developments since 2010 and condemn them as taking place behind the backs of the Australian population and without any pretense of democratic discussion or debate. This accusation was made yesterday by Stephen Fitzgerald, Australia's first ambassador to China, in the Sydney Morning Herald. I do not agree with the conclusions of Mr. Fitzgerald's opinion piece, but he is thoroughly correct when he writes, quote, that the Australian government is a witting part of the US intent to try to deter and contain China through alliance arrangements and Australia's more intimate than ever intelligence and defence enmeshment with the United States, including our participation in US military command arrangements and military manoeuvres in the Pacific. He went on, its position has the complete acquiescence of the opposition, so there's no debate from that quarter, and neither side discusses it frankly with the Australian public. Mr. Fitzgerald indicates that he considers this the selling out of Australia. He wrote, Australian independence is crippled by this subordination to the national interests and great power purposes of the United States, and he advocated, quote, a return to an independent foreign policy viewing the world through the Australian prism and serving Australia's interests. Now the reality is that such criticisms of the US alignment are extremely marginalised. They are lonely voices crying in the wilderness at present. And the reason they are marginalised is because the dominant wing of the establishment does not view their support for the US alliance and all that it entails as selling out. They consider it as entirely serving Australia's interests. That is, the interests of those who benefit within Australia. And that layer is the upper echelons. Australia is among the most unequal of all advanced economies, with the top 10% of the population taking in 30% of all income and controlling 45% of all wealth. Their wealth and incomes are intimately linked with the role of Australia, and in particular Sydney, as an Asia-Pacific hub for financial operations, carried out in direct partnership with Wall Street banks, hedge funds and investment houses. The US is the largest investor in Australia, and the US is by far the largest destination for Australian investment. In 2013, cumulative US investment in Australia was more than $570 billion, as compared to $21 billion from China, while Australian investment in the United States was over $430 billion, compared with just $18 billion in China. Sydney is among the top 10 global financial centres, hosting offices of most of the world's largest banks and finance houses. In 2014, the ASX was the world's 9th largest stock exchange, with a market capitalisation of $1.5 trillion. Banking, finance and insurance has burgeoned in this country during the restructuring implemented from the 1980s, begun by the Hawke and Keating Labor governments, from 3.6% of GDP to over 10.8% in 2012-2013. Finance is the largest sector of the Australian economy, not mining. Australia's banking system is by among the most concentrated and oligarchic in the world. A December 12 study commented, that's December 2012, examination of the top 20 shareholders shows that, on average, over 53% of each big bank, that's the 4 big banks, is owned by shareholders that are among the top 20 shareholders in all the big banks. And the names that are prominent are Citigroup, JP Morgan, HSBC, and so on. For all the talk of Australia's dependency on exports to China, a more accurate description of this country is that the dominant sectors of the economy function as integrated components of a complex web of US-dominated financial institutions and operations. Profits are generated not through the manufacture of commodities, but through rampant speculation in share markets and real estate, derivative, bond and currency trades, and intellectual property right extractions. The entire setup is based on utter parasitism and indifference to the staggering levels of social inequality that exist within Australia, within the United States and internationally. It is a gigantic and ultimately unsustainable Ponzi scheme, which is only able to continue because the global position of the United States ensures the continued flow of capital into its financial markets. With a derivative then flowing to Wall Street's offshoot in Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne. China's rise as the world's largest manufacturing centre is not viewed in the United States or Australia as the main issue. It is the prospect that under conditions of an intractable global economic slump that began with the financial upheavals of 2008, China, along with other powers, will push for a realignment in the flows of global finance. That is why the establishment of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which though small, will be a rival source of finance to US-dominated institutions, provoked such international tensions when Britain, Germany, France and Italy defied Washington and signed up as founding members. Australia, as you probably will know, after discussions with the United States, rejected any participation in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and then radically changed its position after it saw all the European powers move in to get their share of the pie. The predatory aim of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade bloc being advanced by the United States with the backing first of the Gillard and Rudd governments and now of the Abbott government is to subordinate the entire region to American-based finance and corporate interests. Its military component is the pivot to Asia and the preparations for war if China does not submit to US dictates. Now, the Australian ruling classes of 1914 deployed everything they had to support the British Empire in its predatory war with its rival in Germany. The capitalist oligarchs in Australia today, if anything, are even more mercenary and even more venal than their predecessors who sent a generation to kill and be killed in the trenches of World War I. They have joined or backed every neo-colonial US war over the past 25 years, from the Gulf War in '91 to the intrigues in the Balkans, to the invasion of Afghanistan and the flagrantly criminal invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003 on the lies of weapons of mass destruction and stopping terrorism. They are now following the United States into a potentially catastrophic war with China. This is not in the interest of the majority of people who live in Australia, that is the working class. The working class has no stake in the banks and corporations that Australian foreign policy seeks to defend. It has no conflict with the working people of China, the United States or anywhere else. Rather, it has common interests with them to expropriate the immense wealth and productive capacity that exists internationally out of the hands of oligarchs and financial parasites. The danger of war does not stem from politicians selling out or their intentions or their ideas. In the final analysis, it stems from the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, which is a world system which has developed an integrated and interdependent world economy. All of us are dependent on everywhere else, but we live with the continued existence of rival national states dominated by the private ownership of the means of production. Now, those same contradictions, however, give rise to the social force that can prevent war, and that is the convulsive political and social upheavals that are developing and will continue to develop in the working class. I think it's entirely lawful that as we meet tonight in Canberra, another budget is being brought down that will commit tens of billions of dollars to the military and to the intelligence apparatus while slashing jobs, social welfare, health and education. The results of the class war against the working class at home and militarism abroad will be ever greater political struggle against the parties of the political establishment. The political party I'm proud to serve, the SEP, is not going around denouncing Abbott or Shorten or the Greens for selling out Australia, because to do so would only